Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a pretty dense topic, OSHA regulations on overhead gantry cranes. But don't worry, we're going to bring it down and make it as painless as possible.
Absolutely. We'll try to make it clear as mud.
Well, there you go. So this deep dive is especially for, anyone working with cranes on construction sites, safety pros operators, even if you're just thinking about getting your license, this is stuff you got to know.
You got it. It's all about keeping those job sites safe, and OSHA really sets the bar high when it comes to cranes.
Yeah, they do. We're diving specifically into OSHA section 1926.1438. It can get pretty complicated, so buckle up.
Oh, it does. You're in for a ride.
So right off the bat, OSHA makes this distinction between permanently installed cranes, think like a factory setting, versus the ones brought in for construction projects. We're focusing on the temporary setups today.
Right, the ones you're more likely to see out on a construction site day to day. And the regulations get really specific about those temporary cranes. Section 1926.1438B2 lays out a whole bunch of requirements.
Right, so reading through that section, I noticed some of it, it's kind of familiar stuff, it overlaps with general crane safety practices.
Yeah, you'll see some familiar faces in there. Think back to those earlier sections in OSHA, like 1926.1400 through 1414. A lot of those basic safety measures apply across the board no matter what type of crane you're dealing with.
Right, so it's not like they're reinventing the wheel for every single crane out there.
Exactly.
But then things get kind of interesting in 1926.14382. They start pulling in these specific paragraphs from a totally different section. Section 1910.179. Why the mix and match?
Well, what's fascinating is that these specific paragraphs they pulled from section 1910.179, they actually deal with some really fundamental stuff, like inspections, modifications, reporting procedures. It's like OSHA is saying, hey, these things are non-negotiables no matter what type of crane you're working with.
Right, so it's like setting a baseline level of safety regardless of the specific crane setup. Makes sense. Okay, but here's where I really scratch my head. They throw in this curveball about definitions, like hoist and load. They have different meanings here than in typical construction lingo. Why the need to redefine those terms?
Well, in the world of law and regulations, you got to be super precise.
Right.
So by specifically defining those terms, OSHA is eliminating any ambiguity, any room for misinterpretation. It's all about clarity and making sure everyone's on the same page.
Okay, so it's not just about the physical aspects of the crane itself, but also the language we use to talk about it. It's all connected.
Precisely.
And that attention to detail extends to older cranes, too. Equipment made before September 19, 2001 falls under its own set of rules.
Right. They got their own special section, 1926.1438B2.
And again, it's referencing that same section of section 1910.179 we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So if you're dealing with one of those vintage cranes, there's some extra things to keep in mind.
For sure. Those older cranes might have design differences or just more wear and tear over the years. Technology changes, safety standards evolve. So this section likely addresses those specific concerns that might pop up with older equipment.
Right. It's like recognizing that those veteran cranes might need a little extra TLC to meet today's safety standards.
Exactly.
Okay, but what about the brand new cranes fresh off the assembly line? How do the regs apply to them?
For those newer cranes, anything manufactured after September 19th, 2001, OSHA throws us a curveball.
Oh boy, here we go.
They point us to a whole different set of standards. The ASME B30.2 2005, that's spelled out in 1926.1438B23.
ASME. Now, that's a new player in our game today. For those who aren't familiar, can you give us a quick rundown of what ASME is and why their standards matter in this whole crane world?
Sure. ASME stands for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. They're kind of a big deal in the engineering world. They develop codes and standards for all sorts of mechanical equipment, including our friends, the cranes.
Okay, so ASME is like the gold standard for making sure these machines are built right and operate safely.
You got it. They set the benchmarks for design, construction, safety, the whole 9 yards.
All right, so this section of the OSHA regs throws a whole bunch of ASME section numbers at us. Can you break down a few of those for us? What do these sections actually cover, and why are they so important?
Sure. Let's pick a few that are really relevant to, the folks operating these cranes every day. So one example is section 2TEF 3.2.1.1. That one covers load testing, basically making sure the crane can actually handle the weights it's supposed to lift. Pretty crucial, right?
Absolutely. Imagine the consequences if a crane isn't properly tested and it fails under a heavy load. Yikes.
Exactly. That's why these standards are so important. They're not just theoretical guidelines, they're real-world safeguards that protect lives.
Okay, so load testing, that's a big one. What else?
Another important one is 21.13.7. This section deals with all those safety devices you see on a crane, things like limit switches. These are essential for preventing the crane from, overextending, overloading, basically doing things that could lead to a catastrophic failure.
Right. It's all about having those fail-safes in place to prevent human error from turning into a disaster.
Exactly.
Okay, this is all making a lot more sense now.
Mm-hmm.
But before we wrap up this section, I got to ask about something that really caught my eye. OSHA throws in this little curveball about lockout-hackout procedures. They substitute 29 CFR 1910.147 for ANSI Z244.1 in Section 2.3.5.1b of the ASME standards.
Right.
Now, I know what each of those represents, but why the switch?
Good question. OSHA's lockout-tagout standard, the 1910.147, it's generally considered to be more well-rounded and stricter than the ANSI standard.
So is it possible OSHA just felt like their own standard offered better protection for workers? We were talking about procedures designed to prevent serious injuries or even death here.
That's very likely. OSHA's number one priority is worker safety and health. So it makes sense they'd choose the standard they believe provides the most protection.
Right. It's like they're saying we're not taking any chances when it comes to lockout tagout.
Exactly.
So the takeaway here is always double check those OSHA regulations. Even when you're dealing with industry standards, OSHA might have additional or stricter requirements that you need to be aware of.
Absolutely. You can't just assume compliance with one standard automatically means you're in the clear with OSHA.
Great point. All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground here already, from OSHA's specific requirements to ASME's role in crane design and safety.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's all crucial information for anyone working with or around cranes. And we're just getting started, folks. Stay tuned for more in our deep dive into crane safety regulations.
It's all about layering those safety measures.
Right.
Making sure we're covering all the bases.
Exactly. So we've talked about OSHA setting those baseline requirements, but those ASME standards, they really go deep into the nuts and bolts of how these cranes are actually built.
Yeah, ASME's not messing around. They're all about making sure those cranes are safe from the ground up, literally, from the materials used to the placement of those critical safety devices. It's all about preventing accidents before they even have a chance to happen.
Right. So it's like baking safety into the DNA of the crane itself.
Precisely. For example, ASME standards, they'll tell you exactly what type of steel you can use in the crane structure, how strong it needs to be. They even lay out specific requirements for testing things like brakes hooks and wire ropes, those components that are absolutely essential for safe operation.
Wow. So they're not leaving anything to chance.
Nope. They're covering all the angles because at the end of the day, it's about protecting people's lives.
Right. And it goes beyond just the physical parts of the crane, too.
Right. We were talking about ASME's operator training standards earlier. They recognize that even the most perfectly engineered crane is only as safe as the person operating it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can have the safest crane in the world, but if the operator doesn't know what they're doing, things can go wrong very quickly. So ASME really emphasizes the importance of those comprehensive training programs. What are some of the key areas they focus on when it comes to operator training?
Well, they really stress the need for training that goes beyond just the basics. It's not enough to just know how to move the crane around. You got to understand how it works, how to handle different loads, how to respond in emergency situations. It's about developing those critical thinking skills and that ability to react quickly and effectively when things get hairy.
So it's a lot more than just learning how to push buttons and pull levers.
Oh, yeah. It's about having that deep understanding of the machine and its capabilities. So those ASME training standards, they provide guidance on how to develop those comprehensive programs, making sure operators are equipped with the knowledge and skills they need to operate those cranes safely and efficiently.
And this is essential information for our listeners. Whether you're a seasoned operator or just starting out, you got to stay on top of those training requirements.
For sure. It's all about continuous learning and improvement in this field.
Now let's jump back to something we touched on earlier, that OSHA section, referencing both ANSI and OSHA standards for lockout ab procedures.
Yes. The substitution of 29 CFR 1910.147 for ANSI Z244.1. It's interesting.
We talked about what each of those standards represent, but I'm still curious about the why behind the switch.
One thing to keep in mind is that OSHA's lockout tax standard, the 1910.147, it's generally known to be more well-rounded and strict compared to the ANSI standard.
So is it possible that OSHA chose to specifically reference their own standard because they believe it provides that extra level of protection for workers?
That's a very valid point. OSHA's primary mission is to prevent workplace injuries and fatalities, so it makes sense that they would err on the side of caution and reference the standard they consider to be the most protective.
Right, it's like they're saying we're not taking any chances when it comes to lockout hacking.
Exactly, and this highlights a really important point about OSHA regulations in general. They often work hand in hand with industry standards like ANSI, but OSHA always has the authority to go above and beyond those standards when they feel it's necessary to protect workers.
So it's like a safety net on top of a safety net, that extra layer of protection that OSHA brings to the table.
Precisely. And that's something for all of our listeners out there to keep in mind. Compliance with industry standards is definitely important, but it's equally important to know and follow those OSHA regulations, which might be even more stringent in some cases.
Great point. Always got to double check those OSHA regs, folks. Now, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something that's absolutely crucial to preventing crane accidents, pre-lift inspections.
Yes. The pre-lift inspection, it's like the foundation of a safe lift. You're taking the time to really look at the crane, the rigging, the load, the entire environment, making sure everything is in good working order before you even think about lifting that load.
It's about being proactive and spotting those little problems before they turn into big disasters.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about a quick glance over here. We're talking about a systematic, thorough examination of every single critical component.
Okay, so walk us through it. What are some of the key things that need to be checked during a pre-lift inspection?
All right, well, first things first, you got to start with the crane itself. You're looking at its overall condition, checking for any signs of damage, wear, and tear leaks, inspecting those structural components, the brakes, the controls, the safety devices. Everything needs to be in tip-top shape.
Right, you got to make sure the crane itself is up to the task, mechanically sound, and ready to handle whatever load you're about to lift.
Exactly. And then we move on to the rigging. Inspecting those slings, the shackles, the hooks, making sure there's no damage, wear, corrosion. We got to make sure the rigging is rated for the load and that it's set up correctly.
The rigging is that crucial link between the crane and the load.
Yeah.
So there's no room for error there.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we can't forget about the load itself. You got to know how much it weighs, its dimensions, its center of gravity. We need to make sure it's secured properly and that there's no chance of it shifting or coming loose during the lift.
Right. You don't want any surprises once that load is in the air.
Exactly. And finally, you got to look at the surrounding environment, checking for obstacles in the crane's path, overhead power lines, uneven ground, anything that could pose a hazard during the lift.
So it's really about taking a holistic view of the entire operation, considering all the factors that could affect the safety of the lift.
Precisely. And this is where communication is key. The crane operator, the riggers, the signal person, everyone needs to be involved in that pre-lift inspection, sharing their observations and working together to identify and address any potential hazards.
Right. It's a team effort. Everyone needs to be on the same page and committed to safety.
Couldn't agree more. And it's important to remember that the pre-lift inspection isn't a one-and-done kind of thing. You got to constantly be reassessing the situation as conditions change on the job site.
Right. It's about staying vigilant and never getting complacent.
Yeah.
Every lift, every day brings new challenges.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have that solid understanding of the regulations, the standards, the best practices. It's all about building that culture of safety on every job site.
Well said. Now, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about another crucial element in all of this, the role of the signal person.
Ah, yes. The signal person, they're like the unsung heroes of crane operations. They're the ones making sure the communication is crystal clear and that everyone is coordinated during the lift. They're the crane operator's eyes and ears guiding those movements and ensuring the load is moved safely and efficiently.
I like to think of them as the air traffic controllers of the construction site, keeping everything running smoothly and safely up there.
That's a great analogy. And just like an air traffic controller, the signal person needs to have a deep understanding of the crane, what it can do, what its limitations are. They got to know the load being lifted, the surrounding environment. And of course, they need to be fluent in those hand signals and other communication methods used on the job site.
So it's a high-pressure role that demands a lot of skill and attention to detail.
Absolutely. And OSHA knows that. That's why they have specific requirements for signal persons outlining the training and qualifications needed to do that job safely and effectively.
So for our listeners out there who might be interested in becoming a signal person, where can they go to learn more about those training requirements?
Well, the best place to start is always with OSHA, right? specifically Section 1926.1428, which is all about signaling. This section lays out those training requirements for signal persons, including things like hand signals, voice communication, emergency procedures, the whole 9 yards.
Sounds like a pretty comprehensive program.
Oh, it is. And it's got to be taught by a qualified instructor, someone with real-world experience in crane operations and signaling.
Right. It's not just about reading a book. You need that hands-on training from someone who knows the ropes.
Exactly. And once a signal person completes their training, they got to be evaluated. Make sure they understand those signals and can use them effectively in real-life situations.
Right. It's about making sure they're ready to step into that critical role and keep everyone safe.
Exactly. And remember, training is just the first step. A signal person's got to keep learning, keep practicing, keep up with best practices and new technologies. It's a continuous journey.
It's all about that commitment to excellence and safety.
Couldn't agree more. Now let's talk about the actual signaling, what happens during a lift. What are some key things that a signal person needs to keep in mind when they're out there on the job?
Yeah. Let's get into the nitty-gritty.
All right, well, the most important thing is communication. That signal person's got to maintain clear communication with the crane operator at all times, using those standardized hand signals, making sure the operator can see them clearly, confirming that the operator understands what they're supposed to do before giving the signal to proceed.
No room for misunderstandings when you're dealing with heavy machinery.
Exactly, and the signal person also needs to be like a hawk, constantly scanning their surroundings, keeping an eye on the load, the crane's movements, making sure no one's getting too close. They're like the guardian angel of the lift operation.
Love that analogy.
They got to be able to anticipate problems and react quickly to prevent accidents. Like if they see that load swinging out of control, they need to signal the operator to stop the lift immediately. Or if someone wanders into the crane's swing radius, they got to sound the alarm and clear the area.
They're the ones responsible for keeping everyone safe.
Exactly. And OSHA makes it clear that the signal person has the authority to stop the lift at any time if they see a safety hazard. They're not just taking orders, they're empowered to make decisions that prioritize safety above all else.
Right. They're the ultimate authority when it comes to safety during a lift.
Exactly. Now let's dive into those hand signals a little bit. For our listeners who might not be familiar with them, what are some of the most common signals used in crane operations?
Yeah. A lot of folks might be wondering what all that waving and pointing is about.
Right. Well, those hand signals, they're like a universal language on construction sites. They're designed to be clear, concise, and easy to understand. So, for example, to signal raise the boom, you extend your arm and point upward with your index finger. Lower the boom, you do the same thing, but point downward, swing the boom. You extend your arm horizontally and move it in the direction you want the boom to swing.
Okay, makes sense. What about hoisting and lowering the load?
For hoist, you make a fist and move it upward. For lower, you make a fist and move it downward. Pretty straightforward.
Got it. And of course, the most important signal of all, stop.
Exactly. For stop, you extend your arm horizontally and move it back and forth across your body. And if you need to make an emergency stop, you wave both arms above your head.
Okay, so those are the basics. But I imagine there are a lot more signals that signal persons need to know.
Oh yeah, there are a whole bunch of them, but those are the most common ones that you'll see on pretty much every job site.
So those hand signals, they're like the language of crane operations. A way for the signal person and the operator to communicate clearly and effectively, even in a noisy and chaotic environment.
Precisely. And it's important for everyone on the site to have at least a basic understanding of those signals, so they can recognize what's going on during a lift and stay out of harm's way.
Right. It's about creating that shared awareness that's so crucial for safety.
Exactly. Now, even though hand signals are the primary way to communicate during a lift, there are times when voice communication might be necessary or even preferred.
Okay. When would that be the case?
Well, sometimes the distance between the signal person and the operator is just too great for hand signals to be seen clearly, or maybe there's a lot of background noise on the site making it hard to see those signals. In those cases, voice communication can be a lot more effective.
Right. You got to adapt to the situation and use whatever method of communication is going to be the clearest and most reliable.
Exactly. And when you're using voice communication, it's important to be super clear and concise. Use standard terminology, avoid slang or jargon that the operator might not understand. You gotta make sure everyone's speaking the same language, both literally and figuratively.
Great point. So you're saying it's not just about what you say, but how you say it.
Exactly. And it's also a good idea to establish a clear protocol for voice communication, like using the operator's name to get their attention before giving a command.
Right. Got to make sure the operator knows you're talking to them and that they're ready to receive those instructions.
Exactly. And just like with hand signals, it's crucial to confirm that the operator understands the command before giving them the go-ahead to proceed.
It's all about minimizing that risk of miscommunication,
Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with heavy machinery and potentially dangerous situations.
Couldn't agree more. Now, I want to touch on something we mentioned earlier, the importance of ongoing training and professional development for crane operators and signal persons.
Right. This isn't a learn it once and you're done kind of field.
Definitely not. The crane industry is constantly evolving. New equipment, new techniques, new regulations popping up all the time. So crane operators and signal persons, they got to stay ahead of the curve. Keep learning and refining their skills. If they don't, they risk falling behind and potentially putting themselves and others at risk.
So what are some ways that crane operators and signal persons can stay current in their field? What resources are out there?
Well, there are a lot of great professional organizations that offer training courses, certifications, and other resources.
Yep.
The National Commission for the Certification of Crane Operators, NCCCO, is a great example. They've got a wide range of certifications for operators, rigorous signal persons. If you're looking to boost your credentials, gain new skills, or just stay on top of your game, NCCCO is a great place to start.
Awesome. What about industry associations? Do they offer any training opportunities?
Absolutely. Many of them do, like the Associated General Contractors of America, or AGC. They have training programs and resources specifically for crane professionals.
So it's about networking, attending conferences, taking advantage of those training opportunities, staying connected to the industry.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about all the online resources out there. OSHA's website is a goldmine of information, regulations, standards, safety tips, you name it.
So there's really no excuse for not staying informed.
Nope. The information is out there. You just got to be proactive and seek it out.
Great point. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about another critical aspect of crane safety, proper maintenance.
Ah, yes, maintenance. It's the foundation of a safe and reliable crane. You got to keep those machines in tip-top shape with regular inspections, preventative maintenance, and timely repairs. It's not just about keeping the crane running, it's about keeping it running safely.
Right. You can't just ignore those little squeaks and rattles. You got to stay on top of things.
Exactly. And just like with those pre-lift inspections, crane maintenance needs to be systematic and thorough. You got to have a regular schedule for inspecting every critical component, lubricating those moving parts, making adjustments, replacing worn or damaged parts, taking a proactive approach instead of waiting for things to break down.
Right. It's all about prevention.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to keep detailed records of every maintenance activity, That way you can track the crane's service history, spot potential problems early on, and make sure all the necessary repairs and replacements are done promptly.
Right. It's like building a medical record for the crane.
Exactly. And those records can come in handy big time if there's ever an accident or an OSHA inspection. You're showing them that you're taking safety seriously and doing everything you can to keep that crane in good working order.
Okay. So we've got regular inspections, preventive maintenance, detailed records. What else is crucial when it comes to crane maintenance?
Well, you got to have the right people doing the work. Crane maintenance is not a DIY project. You need qualified technicians, folks who are trained and experienced in working on these complex machines. They got to understand the manufacturer's specs, the safety standards, the potential hazards. It's not just about turning a wrench, it's about protecting lives.
Right. So it's about having that specialized knowledge and expertise.
Exactly. Now let's talk about some specific maintenance tasks that are particularly important for crane safety. One of the big ones is brake inspection and maintenance. The brakes are what keep that crane from moving unexpectedly, so they got to be in perfect working order at all times.
So we're talking regular inspections, adjustments, lubrication, replacing those worn brake pads.
Exactly. Another crucial one is wire rope inspection and maintenance. That wire rope is what's holding the load, so it needs to be free of any damage, wear, corrosion.
So you're visually inspecting the wire rope, lubricating it properly, and replacing it when it's reached the end of its service life.
Exactly. And you got to use the right type and grade of wire rope for the specific application. Using the wrong one could lead to premature failure, and, that could be catastrophic.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Nope. And then there's lubrication. Proper lubrication is so important for any machine. It reduces friction, wear, heat, all those things that can shorten the lifespan of the crane and make it less safe to operate.
So it's about keeping those moving parts moving smoothly and preventing premature wear and tear.
Precisely. And you got to use the correct type of lubricant for each component. Using the wrong one can actually do more harm than good.
Okay, so it's not just about slathering some grease on everything.
Nope. It's about being specific and using the right product for the job.
Now, I want to touch on something that I think is often overlooked, the proper storage and handling of crane components.
Ah, yes. Even when a crane's not being used, you got to take care of it. Store it in a dry, protected environment, cover it up to protect it from the elements, handle those components carefully to prevent damage. It's all about preserving the life of the machine and ensuring its safety.
Right. It's about showing that crane some respect even when it's off duty.
Exactly. And always refer to the manufacturer's recommendations for storage and handling. Some components might have special needs.
Okay. Good to know. Now let's talk about the people who are ultimately responsible for all of this. The crane owner and the employer.
Right. At the end of the day, it's the owner and the employer who are responsible for ensuring the safety of their employees and anyone else who might be affected by the crane's operation. They have a legal and moral obligation to provide a safe work environment and make sure those cranes are operated and maintained safely.
So their responsibilities extend beyond just providing the crane and telling people to go to work.
Oh, absolutely. They're responsible for a whole range of things, like providing comprehensive safety training for everyone involved in crane operations, operators, riggers, signal persons, you name it. They also got to develop and implement safe work procedures, make sure those cranes are regularly inspected and maintained by qualified technicians, provide the right PPE for workers, investigate accidents and near misses, the whole 9 yards.
So it's really a holistic approach to safety encompassing every aspect of crane operations.
Precisely. And it's not just about checking boxes and complying with regulations. It's about creating a culture where safety is everyone's top priority, where workers feel comfortable speaking up if they see something unsafe. Building that safety culture from the ground up.
It's about creating that environment where everyone looks out for each other.
Exactly. And that's what really makes a difference in preventing accidents and saving lives.
Well said.
Yeah.
Now, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something that's often overlooked in discussions about crane safety, the importance of proper ground conditions.
Ah, yes. The ground beneath the crane. That's something you can't afford to ignore. It's got to be able to support the weight of the crane and the load it's lifting. It's got to be level and free of obstacles that could cause the crane to tip over. A stable foundation is essential.
So it's not just about the crane itself, it's about the environment it's operating in.
Exactly. And assessing ground conditions is a critical part of that pre-lift inspection.
Why?
We got to consider things like the type of soil, the moisture content, the presence of underground utilities or voids. Really get a sense of how stable that ground is.
Sounds like a pretty involved process.
It is. And sometimes you might need to bring in a geotechnical engineer or another qualified professional to get a more in-depth assessment. If there are any doubts about the ground stability, you got to err on the side of caution.
Right. Better safe than sorry. So what are some of the things you're looking for when you're assessing ground conditions? What are some red flags?
Well, one of the most common hazards is soft or unstable soil, If the soil is too soft, it can compress under the weight of the crane and cause it to settle or even tip over. This is especially a concern after heavy rains or in areas with high water tables.
Okay, so you got to be extra cautious in those situations.
Absolutely. Another thing to watch out for is uneven ground. If the ground is sloping or has depressions or mounds, it can create an unstable base for the crane that can cause the crane to tilt or shift, which increases the risk of tip over.
So you got to make sure that ground is as level as possible.
Right. And then there's the issue of underground utilities or voids. If the crane is set up over an underground sewer line or a buried tank, the ground could collapse under its weight, and that could be a major disaster.
So it's crucial to get those utility locates before setting up the crane.
Absolutely. Can't emphasize that enough. Now let's talk about what can happen if you ignore those ground conditions and operate a crane on unstable ground.
Yeah. What are the potential consequences?
Well, the most obvious one is the risk of tip over. If the ground gives way or the crane shifts, it can tip over. And that can result in serious injuries or fatalities, not just to the crane operator, but to anyone who happens to be nearby.
That's a scary thought.
It is. And it's not just about the risk of tip over. Operating a crane on unstable ground can also damage the crane itself, put stress on its structural components and potentially cause cracks, bends, even complete failure.
So it could actually shorten the lifespan of the crane.
Exactly. And it can also damage the load the crane is lifting, which can lead to financial losses and delays. And if the crane tips over, it can damage nearby structures, vehicles, equipment. The potential for collateral damage is huge.
So it's not just about the people directly involved in the lift operation. It's about the potential for widespread damage and disruption.
Exactly. And those costs can add up quickly. So let's talk about some strategies for mitigating those risks associated with unstable ground.
Yeah. What can be done to make those lifts safer?
Well, the first step is that thorough ground assessment that we talked about. Visually inspecting the ground, probing the soil, obtaining those utility locates. If there are any concerns about the ground's stability, you got to bring in a geotechnical engineer or another qualified professional to get a more in-depth assessment.
So it's about getting the experts involved if needed.
Exactly. And once you've done that assessment, you need to develop a plan for mitigating any risks that were identified. That might involve improving the ground stability, compacting the soil, adding gravel or other fill material, using those specialized ground mats. It might also involve using outriggers to distribute the weight of a crane more evenly, or you might need to adjust the crane setup, reduce its reach or lifting capacity to lessen the load on the ground.
So it's a multifaceted approach using a combination of engineer controls and operational adjustments.
Exactly. It's about being smart and proactive, taking the necessary steps to ensure that crane has a solid and stable foundation.
Well said. Now let's talk about another factor that can have a big impact on crane safety: the weather.
Ah, yes, the weather. You can't control it, but you can certainly prepare for it. High winds, heavy rain, snow, ice, all those things can create hazards for crane operators and anyone working nearby.
Right. You got to respect Mother Nature.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So before you even think about starting a crane operation, you got to check the forecast and be prepared to adjust your plans or postpone the work if the weather's not cooperating.
So you're constantly monitoring the weather and staying flexible.
Exactly. And it's not just about the current conditions. It's about being aware of the potential for sudden changes. A lift that starts out under sunny skies can turn dangerous in a hurry if a thunderstorm rolls in.
So you got to stay vigilant and be ready to react to those changing conditions.
Exactly. Now let's break down some specific weather hazards and talk about how to mitigate them. One of the big ones is high winds.
Yeah, wind can definitely make things tricky when you're operating a crane.
For sure. High winds can cause the crane to sway or even tip over, and they can also blow the load off course, potentially striking workers or objects on the ground.
So how do you deal with wind when you're operating a crane?
Well, the first thing is to monitor wind speeds carefully and establish wind limits for crane operations. Most crane manufacturers provide wind speed charts that tell you the maximum safe wind speed for operating the crane under different conditions.
So you got to know your crane and its limitations.
Exactly. And if the wind speed gets too high, you got to shut down operations immediately. Secure the crane and the load. It's not worth taking the risk.
Right. Safety first. Now, what about rain?
Heavy rain can create a whole bunch of problems for crane operations. It can reduce visibility, making it hard for the operator to see what they're doing. It can make the ground slippery, increasing the risk of the crane slipping or tipping over. And it can also create electrical hazards if water gets into the crane's electrical system.
So operating a crane in the rain is definitely not ideal.
Nope, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. So if you are operating a crane in the rain, you got to be extra cautious and take steps to mitigate the risks.
Like what?
Well, one thing you might do is reduce the crane's operations, reduce its reach or lifting capacity to improve stability in those wet conditions. You can also use ground mats to help distribute the weight of the crane more evenly and prevent it from sinking into the soft ground. And it's important to make sure there's adequate drainage. You don't want water pooling around the crane's outriggers or the base of the crane. That can undermine its stability.
So it's all about being aware of the potential hazards and taking steps to minimize those risks.
Exactly. Now let's talk about another weather challenge, snow and ice.
Oh, yeah. Those are some tough conditions to work in.
Definitely, snow and ice can make crane operations extremely hazardous. They reduce visibility, make surfaces slippery, and add extra weight to the crane and the load, which could potentially exceed the crane's capacity.
So you got to be extra careful when you're operating a crane in winter conditions?
Absolutely. Here are a few things to keep in mind. First, you got to clear snow and ice from the crane and the surrounding work area. That'll improve visibility and reduce the risk of slips and falls. You might also want to use tire chains or other traction devices to improve the crane's stability on those slick surfaces. And it's important to de-ice the crane's controls and other critical components, Prevent ice buildup, which can interfere with the crane's operation.
So it's all about being proactive and taking the necessary steps to ensure that crane can operate safely in those winter conditions.
Exactly. You got to be prepared for anything Mother Nature throws at you.
Now, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something that's particularly relevant to crane operators, the importance of maintaining situational awareness.
Ah, yes, situational awareness. It's crucial for anyone operating heavy machinery, but it's especially important for crane operators who are often working in these complex and dynamic environments. They got to be constantly aware of everything that's going on around them.
So what does that mean in the context of crane operations? What does it look like?
Well, it means being aware of your surroundings, the position of the crane, the load, the rigging, other workers, any potential hazards. It also means being aware of the crane's capabilities and limitations, knowing its load charts, its reach, its stability under different conditions. Having that knowledge is crucial for making safe decisions.
So it's not just about knowing how to operate the crane, it's about understanding its personality, so to speak.
Exactly. Every crane has its own quirks, its strengths and weaknesses. A skilled operator knows how to work with those characteristics to ensure a safe and efficient lift.
And that comes with experience with training, with that ongoing commitment to learning that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Crane operation is a journey, not a destination. You're always learning, always striving to improve your skills and deepen your understanding of the craft.
Well said. Now, for our listeners out there who are either working as crane operators or hoping to join this field, what are some key takeaways you'd like to leave them with?
I think the most important thing is to always put safety first. It's easy to get caught up in the pressure of deadlines and the demands of the job, but safety should never be compromised.
It's about making those conscious choices every step of the way to protect yourself and the people around you.
Exactly. And that means being prepared, being knowledgeable, and being willing to speak up if you see something unsafe. Don't be afraid to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, to advocate for safer practices. Be that voice of reason, that champion of safety on every job site.
Right. It's about taking ownership of your safety and the safety of your coworkers.
Couldn't agree more. And remember, folks, this deep dive into crane safety regulations was brought to you by Safety One Source.
They're an incredible resource for everything safety related, training, consulting, equipment, supplies, whatever you need to create a safer work environment, they've got you covered.
So check them out if you haven't already.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about something that's really at the heart of crane safety: risk assessment and hazard identification.
Yes. A proactive approach to safety. That's always the best way to go. Before you even think about operating the crane, you got to thoroughly assess that job site, identify any potential hazards, and come up with a plan to mitigate those risks.
Right. It's all about thinking ahead and anticipating those problems before they have a chance to arise.
Exactly. And this involves looking at a whole bunch of factors. The type of load being lifted, the crane's capacity, the surrounding environment, the weather conditions, the proximity of other workers or structures. It's a holistic approach, taking into account all those variables that could potentially impact the safety of the lift.
So it's not just about focusing on the crane itself, it's about looking at the bigger picture.
Precisely. And it's not a one-time thing either. That risk assessment needs to be an ongoing process. Conditions can change rapidly on a construction site. So you got to be constantly evaluating the situation and making adjustments as needed.
It's about staying vigilant and never becoming complacent.
Exactly. Now let's get a little more specific. What are some practical steps that safety professionals and crane operators can take to effectively identify and mitigate hazards on a construction site?
Yeah. What are some tools and techniques that they can use?
Well, one of the most effective tools is the Job Safety Analysis, or JSA. It's basically a step-by-step process for analyzing a task and identifying potential hazards associated with each step.
It's a methodical way to break down the work and think about what could go wrong.
Exactly. For example, if you're lifting a load with a crane, the JSA would look at things like the possibility of the load shifting during the lifting, the crane tipping over obstacles in the crane's path, even something as simple as a worker tripping over a loose cable on the ground. Now, it's about thinking through all the possibilities, no matter how small or insignificant they might seem.
Right. Leave no stone unturned.
Exactly. And once you've identified those hazards, the next step is to come up with ways to control them to mitigate those risks.
So it's not just about identifying the problem, it's about finding solutions.
Precisely. So let's say the JSA identifies the risk of a load shifting during the lift. One way to mitigate that risk would be to use taglines to stabilize the load, or maybe adjust the rigging configuration. If the risk is the crane tipping over, you might need to make sure the crane is properly leveled and use outriggers for added stability. It's about taking those proactive steps to address the hazards and make the work environment safer.
So it's about having a plan and putting it into action.
Exactly. And it's important to document those control measures and make sure everyone involved in the operation is aware of them.
Right. Communication is key. Got to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about another critical aspect of crane safety, the role of the signal person. Ah, yes. The signal person, they're like the conductor of the orchestra,
Yeah,
making sure all the moving parts are working together harmoniously during the lift.
that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key responsibilities of a signal person?
Well, their primary responsibility is to communicate with the crane operator and guide the crane's movements. They use a standardized set of hand signals to tell the operator what to do, raise the boom, swing the boom, hoist the load, lower the load, and so on.
Okay, so they're like the eyes and ears of the crane operator.
Exactly. And they also need to be constantly aware of their surroundings, keeping an eye on the load, the rigging, the crane's movements, other workers, any potential hazards in the area.
Right, they got to be on high alert the whole time.
Exactly. And they also need to have a solid understanding of the crane's capabilities, its load charts, its reach, how stable it is under different conditions.
So it's not just about knowing the hand signals. It's
Yeah.
about having that broader knowledge of crane operations and safety.
Absolutely. Now, OSHA has specific requirements for signal persons, outlining the training and qualifications they need to have.
So for our listeners out there who might be thinking about becoming a signal person, what does that training involve?
Well, the training covers a wide range of topics, things like hand signals, voice communication, emergency procedures. They'll also learn about crane operations and safety best practices. It's a pretty comprehensive program.
Sounds like it. So where can folks go to get this training?
A good place to start is with the National Commission for the Certification of Crane Operators, or NCCCO. They offer a certification program specifically for signal persons.
So if you're serious about becoming a signal person, getting certified by NCCCO is a great way to demonstrate your knowledge and skills.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about some of the qualities that make a good signal person.
Yeah. What are some of the traits that someone should have if they're considering this line of work?
Well, first and foremost, they need to have excellent communication skills. They got to be able to communicate clearly and effectively with the crane operator using those hand signals and voice commands.
Right. Clear communication is essential. There's no room for misunderstandings when you're dealing with heavy machinery.
Exactly. They also need to have good attention to detail.
Yeah.
They got to be able to spot potential hazards and react quickly to prevent accidents.
So they need to be observant and alert the whole time.
Exactly. And they also need to be able to stay calm under pressure. Things can get pretty hectic on a construction site. So it's important to be able to think clearly and make good decisions even when things are moving fast.
Right. So it's not a job for the faint of heart.
Nope. You got to be able to handle the pressure. Now let's talk about another crucial aspect of crane safety: proper rigging.
Rigging. That's what connects the load to the crane, right?
Exactly. It's basically a system of slings, chains, hooks, and other hardware that's used to lift and move loads.
Okay. So why is proper rigging so important for safety?
Well, if the rigging isn't done correctly, that load could come loose and fall, causing serious damage or even fatalities. A lot of things can go wrong if the rigging isn't up to snuff.
Like what?
Well, for starters, you could have the wrong type of sling for the load, or the sling could be damaged or worn out. And if the hooks and other hardware aren't properly secured, the whole thing could come apart.
That's scary stuff. So how do you make sure the rigging is done right?
Well, the first step is to make sure you're using the right type of rigging for the job.
Yeah.
Different slings are designed for different types of loads. So you got to match the sling to the load.
Right. It's not one size fits all.
Exactly. You also got to inspect the rigging carefully before every lift. Make sure those slings are in good condition, that the hooks are secure, that there's no damage or wear and tear. And if you see anything that looks even slightly off, don't use it. Replace it.
So it's about being proactive and catching those problems before they turn into accidents.
Exactly. And it's also important to make sure the rigging is properly configured. The angles of the slings, the placement of the hooks, the way the load is balanced, all those things can affect the stability of the lift.
So it's not just about throwing some chains around the load and calling it a day.
Nope, there's a science to it. You got to make sure everything is set up correctly to distribute the weight of the load evenly and prevent it from shifting or tipping during the lift.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here today, from OSHA regulations and ASME standards to pre-lift inspections and rigging practices. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's all crucial information for anyone who works with or around cranes.
Absolutely. And I hope our listeners are walking away with a deeper understanding of the complexities of crane safety and a renewed commitment to making safety their top priority.
Me too. Crane safety is a shared responsibility. It's up to everyone on the job site to be aware of the hazards and to follow those safe work practices.
Well said. And remember, folks, this deep dive into crane safety regulations was brought to you by Safety One Source.
They're a fantastic resource for all things safety related, so be sure to check them out.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'd like to thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey into the world of crane safety. We hope you found it informative, engaging, and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Remember, safety is everyone's business. Let's all work together to create a work environment where everyone goes home safe at the end of the day.
Well said. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you on the next episode of The Deep Dive.